Chosen one, before you read any further, understand something. You are not being observed by chance. You are being invited, quietly, one confirmation at a time, into a circle that only opens its door for people who survived what you survived. You didn't send an application. You didn't campaign for attention. You simply kept choosing faith when fear would have been so much easier, and somewhere along the way, someone with real influence started paying attention to a version of you that nobody else was watching. Not your highlight reel, not your best angles. The quiet, unglamorous moments where you kept moving even when moving made no sense to anyone but you. This video is going to walk you through every invitation that's already been extended to you, whether you notice them arriving or not. Before we open the first one, drop 777 in the comments if you can feel that something has shifted around you lately, even if you can't quite explain it. And subscribe, because this circle doesn't stop watching once it starts. Let's open the first invitation. The first invitation was extended the moment your calm stopped looking like weakness and started looking like a signal. For a long time, people around you mistook your steadiness for something smaller than it was. They called it naive. They called it delusional. They assumed anyone still hopeful after everything you'd survived simply hadn't been paying attention to how bad things really were. What they didn't understand is that your hope was never blind. It was calibrated, built specifically to withstand exactly the kind of storms you kept walking through. Here's what they never saw. While they were performing confidently loudly, chasing whatever reaction got the fastest applause, you were quietly emitting a completely different frequency, one that only people trained to notice real signal, instead of noise, could actually pick up on. Loud confidence is easy to fake. Quiet consistency is nearly impossible to fake, because it requires showing up the same way on the days nobody is watching, which is exactly the kind of behavior that eventually reaches the right ears. Someone with actual discernment doesn't look at who's shouting the loudest. They look at who kept their composure the night everything fell apart. They look at who stayed kind after being betrayed instead of hardening into bitterness. They look at who chose to trust the process one more time, even when trusting felt like the most illogical decision available. That's the frequency this first invitation was extended to, not your applause moments, your survival moments. And here's the detail that should sit with you the longest. You weren't performing for this invitation. You didn't know anyone was listening. That's exactly why it's real. There's a reason this kind of frequency takes so long to be noticed by the right people. It doesn't advertise itself. It doesn't come with a highlight reel or a caption explaining what it cost you. It simply exists quietly in the pattern of 100 small decisions nobody was recording. And patterns like that only become visible to observers patient enough to watch long enough to see them repeat. The second invitation came after an evaluation you never realized was happening, one that ran quietly in the background of your worst seasons. Think about what that season actually looked like from the outside. Betrayals arriving without warning. Silence from people who swore they'd never leave. Nights where you were falling apart internally, but still had to function the next morning like nothing was wrong. You assumed it was just life being cruel again. You didn't know every reaction you had during that stretch was being recorded, not by a person standing over your shoulder, but by the pattern of your own behavior, quietly building a case for who you actually are underneath the pressure. Most people, when tested this way, without warning and without preparation, reveal exactly what they're made of. Some collapse instantly, blaming everyone around them for their circumstances. Others go numb, disappearing into whatever version of themselves requires the least effort to maintain. And a small number, the ones this invitation was written for, keep choosing harder, more disciplined response even when nobody is in notice or rewarded. You were one of the small numbers. Every time fear told you to give up on faith, and you didn't. Every time bitterness offered you an easier emotional exit, and you declined it. Every time revenge would have felt satisfying, and you chose patience instead. Each of those moments became a data point in an evaluation you never signed up for, and you pass it with a kind of consistency most people can't manufacture on command. This invitation isn't congratulating you for surviving. It's acknowledging that you survived in a way that revealed exactly the kind of character rooms of real influence are always quietly searching for. What makes this particular evaluation so unusual is that you couldn't have studied for it even if you'd known it was happening. There was no answer key, no rubric no way to prepare your response in advance. The only way to pass a test like that is to already be the kind of person the test was designed to reveal, which means your passing grade was never really a performance. It was simply evidence of who you already were. The third invitation exists because of what your resilience did to everyone standing near you, whether they realize it or not. Here's something nobody tells you about surviving publicly. Your survival becomes a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable for people who don't like what they see reflected back. The moment you refuse to collapse, everyone around you got sorted automatically into two categories, whether you meant to sort them or not. Some people leaned in closer, uncomfortable with your strength because it exposed how little their own they actually had. Others quietly stepped back, relieved you didn't need them to prove anything. That sorting process wasn't cruel. It was simply honest, and honesty at that level tended to happen whether you intend it or not. The people who couldn't stand near your resilience without feeling exposed removed themselves from your circle long before this invitation was ever extended. And that removal wasn't a loss. It was clarification. The universe quietly filtering your circle down to the names that could actually withstand proximity to someone who doesn't fold. This invitation acknowledges something important. You didn't need to confront anyone, expose anyone, or prove anyone wrong. Your consistency did all of that work silently, and the names left standing near you now are the ones who survived the filtering, not because they were told to stay, but because your presence didn't threaten them the way it threatened everyone else. It's worth sitting with how uncomfortable that sorting process must have felt in the moment, even if you couldn't name exactly what was happening. Losing people rarely feels like clarity while it's happening. It usually just feels like a loss. But distance from this vantage point tends to reveal that the sorting was never really a loss at all. It was simply your circle finally matching the size of who you'd actually become. The fourth invitation was extended because of everything you did when there was absolutely no audience to perform for, while other people were building their identity around visible wins, curated moments designed specifically to be seen and admired. You were doing something far less glamorous. You were choosing the harder, quieter, more disciplined path in situations where nobody would have known the difference if you'd taken the easier shortcut instead. Nobody was there to catch you cutting corners. Nobody would have known if you'd let your standards slip just once, just to make things easier on yourself. You didn't slip, not because you were trying to impress anyone, but because you'd already decided the standard mattered more than the audience. That decision, repeated quietly over and over during periods nobody was documenting, is exactly the kind of discipline that eventually becomes visible in ways you don't expect. Think about what discipline actually looks like when nobody's watching. It looks like showing up to the version of yourself you promised to become, even on the days that promise feels pointless. It looks like maintaining your integrity in situations specifically designed to test whether your integrity was ever real to begin with. It looks like choosing the long, unglamorous route toward growth instead of the shortcut that would have felt better in the moment, but cost you something more valuable later. This invitation exists because that private discipline eventually built a foundation strong enough for someone influential to notice, even though you never built it hoping anyone would. There's a particular kind of loneliness in maintaining standards nobody is there to witness, and it's worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over. Discipline without an audience can feel, in the moment, like it's pointless, like nobody will ever know the difference either way. But that exact loneliness is what separates discipline that's real from discipline that only exists for show, and real discipline always eventually finds its way into rooms built specifically to recognize it. The fifth invitation was extended the moment your hardest season stopped looking like destruction and started looking like transformation. There's a version of you that existed before the worst had happened, and there's a version standing here now, and the distance between those two versions is the entire reason this invitation exists. The fire that was supposed to end you instead became the exact process that refined you into someone capable of handling weight most people never developed the capacity to carry. Think about what actually happens to two different people thrown into the same difficult circumstances. One collapses, blaming the fire for everything it took from them. The other, eventually, starts noticing what the fire left behind once everything unnecessary burned away. You are the second kind, not because the fire hurt any less for you than it would have hurt anyone else, but because you kept choosing to let it refine you instead of letting it define you as a victim. This is the kind of transformation people with real influence are trained to recognize instantly because they've seen exactly how rare it is. Most people who go through what you went through come out either bitter or broken. You came out sharper, calmer, and more useful than you were before, and that particular outcome doesn't happen by accident. It happens because somewhere in the middle of the fire, you made a decision most people never make, to keep choosing faith even while everything around you is actively burning. It's also worth being honest about what this kind of transformation actually costs. Nobody walks through real fire and comes out exactly the same, and pretending otherwise would dishonor what you actually went through. The refinement this invitation recognizes isn't painless. It's simply real, built from a version of you that had every reason to give up and chose again and again not to. The sixth invitation exists because of what happened the moment you stopped explaining yourself to people who were never going to understand you anyway. Silence, used the way you use it, does something most people underestimate entirely. It doesn't just protect you. It reveals everyone around you. The moment you stop defending yourself against every accusation, every rumor, every attempt to provoke a reaction, you create a kind of pressure that only guilty intentions struggle to survive. People who meant you no harm stayed steady around your silence. People who were hiding something started unraveling under it. Unable to handle a target that refused to react the way they expected, you didn't design your silence as a weapon. You simply ran out of energy for explaining yourself to people who'd already decided not to believe you regardless of what you said. But that silence, unintentional as a strategy, functioned exactly like one anyway. It became the mirror that forced hidden intentions into the open without you ever having to accuse anyone of anything directly. This invitation recognizes something specific. The composure you maintained while everyone around you scrambled to manage their own guilt wasn't passive. It was one of the most quietly powerful things you ever did, and people who understand real influence know exactly how rare that kind of restraint actually is. There's a specific discomfort in choosing silence when every part of you wants to defend yourself loudly, and that discomfort deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal. Silence, held under provocation, takes a kind of internal discipline most people never develop, precisely because it requires trusting that the truth will surface eventually without your intervention. You trusted that, and it did. The seventh invitation was extended because of everything about you that other people tried and failed to replicate. You've likely noticed this pattern already, even if you never named it out loud. People around you have borrowed your language, mimicked your choices, copied the outward appearance of the path you were walking, hoping that imitating the visible parts would somehow produce the same result. It never worked for them, and it never will, because what they were copying was never the source. It was just the shadow the source happened to cast. Your purpose wasn't something you constructed for an audience. It was carved slowly, through circumstances nobody would have chosen voluntarily, refined by consequences that couldn't be faked or performed. That kind of purpose has a texture to it that imitation simply cannot replicate, no matter how closely someone studies the surface. People with real discernment can tell the difference within seconds, because authentic purpose carries a weight that borrowed confidence never quite manages to hold. This invitation acknowledges that difference directly. You were never chosen because you were the loudest or the most polished. You were chosen because what you carry cannot be counterfeited, and counterfeits, however convincing on the surface, eventually reveal themselves under any real pressure. There's something almost lonely about carrying a purpose nobody else can replicate, because it often means walking a path without much company along the way. But that isolation is also exactly what makes the path yours. Purpose built in collaboration with a crowd tends to dissolve the moment the crowd moves on to something else. Purpose built in isolation tends to outlast every trend that ever tried to compete with it. The eighth invitation was extended because of the places you walked out of that most people never climb out of at all. Some of what you survived wasn't just difficult. It was a kind of experience that quietly ends a person's spirit long before it ends anything visible on the outside. Loss that reshapes how you trust. Betrayal specifically designed to break your sense of identity. Seasons so dark that most people who enter them never fully return the same, if they return at all. You returned, not unscathed and not pretending the damage wasn't real, but returned nonetheless, carrying something most survivors of that depth of pain don't manage to hold on to, your capacity for warmth. You didn't emerge cold. You didn't emerge bitter. You emerge more careful, more discerning, and somehow still capable of extending grace, which is one of the rarest outcomes possible from that particular kind of suffering. This invitation exists because that outcome, warm surviving where hardness would have been so much easier to justify, is exactly the kind of rare character real influence gets built around. You didn't just survive the grave. You turned what should have buried you into the foundation. Everything after it now stands on. It's worth naming directly how rare it actually is to survive that level of loss without becoming someone smaller because of it. Most people who endure what you endured build walls. And the walls make sense. They're a reasonable response to real damage. What's rare is choosing to keep the door open anyway, keeping your capacity for trust and warmth intact even after it's been so thoroughly tested. The ninth invitation was extended the moment the people working against you accidentally revealed themselves through their own impatience. Here's what happens to people who build plans around your expected collapse. They wait and wait and wait for the moment you finally break the way they predicted you would. And when that moment refuses to arrive, their patience runs out long before yours does. Frustration makes people sloppy. Sloppy people expose their intentions in ways careful people never would have. You didn't have to unmask anyone. You just had to keep standing calmly, consistently, while the people counting on your collapse grew increasingly desperate for evidence that never came. Their own impatience did the exposing for you. And by the time it was finished, everyone paying close attention could see exactly who had been rooting for your downfall the entire time. This invitation recognizes that particular kind of quiet victory, the one where you never had to lift a finger to prove anyone's true intentions, because your steadiness alone was enough pressure to force the truth into the open. There's a quiet satisfaction available here that's worth allowing yourself to feel without guilt. You didn't manufacture anyone's downfall. You simply refused to provide the collapse they were waiting for, and their own impatience did the rest. That's not vindictiveness. That's simply what happens when the truth is given enough time and enough of your composure to finally surface on its own. The 10th invitation was extended because of how differently you handled chaos, compared to everyone performing bravery around you. There's a specific kind of strength that only shows up under real pressure, and it's almost never the loud kind. The people shouting the loudest during a crisis are usually the ones least equipped to actually handle it. Real composure looks almost boring from the outside. Steady breathing, clear thinking, decisions made without needing an audience to validate them. That's the strength you kept demonstrating, quietly, while everyone around you mistook noise for courage. Someone with genuine authority doesn't measure strength by volume. They measure it by what a person does in the exact moments when panic will be the easier, more socially acceptable response. You chose the harder, quieter response over and over, and that pattern, repeated enough times, becomes impossible for the right kind of observer to overlook. This invitation is a recognition of exactly that pattern, the strength that never needed anyone's applause to remain real. It's worth noticing how often composure gets mistaken for indifference by people who've never had to develop it themselves. Your calm was never the absence of feeling. It was the presence of enough internal control to keep functioning even while feeling everything fully. That distinction matters, because it's exactly what separates people who look strong from people who actually are. The 11th invitation was extended because you never traded your integrity for a shortcut, even when the shortcut was readily available. Along the way, you were offered easier paths more than once, paths that would have required compromising something you weren't willing to compromise, approval in exchange for silence about something that mattered, comfort in exchange for shrinking yourself into a version people found less threatening, validation in exchange for abandoning the standards that made your growth genuine in the first place. You declined those trades repeatedly, even when declining cost you something real in the moment. That refusal, choosing the harder, more expensive integrity over the easier, cheaper compromise, is exactly the kind of behavior real influence is built to notice, because it proves you're not for sale in ways that make most people easy to manipulate or control. This invitation exists specifically because of that refusal. You didn't become who you are by being purchased into a smaller version of yourself. There's a cost to every refusal like this that's worth acknowledging honestly. Declining an easier path always means living with whatever the harder path actually demands of you, and that demand doesn't disappear just because the outcome eventually justified it. You paid that cost repeatedly, without knowing for certain it would ever be recognized. That uncertainty is exactly what makes a decision meaningful. The 12th invitation was extended the moment your choice to respond with grace instead of bitterness became impossible for anyone paying attention to ignore. It would have been so much easier to become hard after everything you went through. Nobody would have blamed you for it. And yet you kept choosing grace anyway, not because you were naive about what people had done, but because you understood something most people never learn. That grace doesn't require forgetting what happened. It simply refuses to let what happened determine who you become. That grace, maintained under circumstances that would have justified bitterness completely, is one of the rarest qualities real influence looks for, because it proves you can be trusted with weight without becoming corrupted by the process of carrying it. There's a particular kind of strength required to extend grace to people who never apologize, never acknowledge what they did, and likely never will. That strength doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from deciding that carrying resentment costs more than releasing it does, and making that calculation consistently, even on the days it would have been so much easier not to. The 13th invitation was never about testing whether you could survive difficulty. You'd already proven that. This one tested whether you could handle something far rarer, success without losing yourself in the process. Anyone can talk about handling pressure when pressure is still theoretical. The real test comes later, quietly, when opportunities finally start arriving and a person has to decide whether the humility that carried them through the hard years survives contact with easier ones. Plenty of people who endure real hardship come out the other side only to lose themselves the moment things finally start going well, trading the humility that built them for an ego that eventually unravels everything they worked for. This invitation exists because of a quieter kind of readiness, the evidence that you'd already decided, long before any results arrived, that whatever came next wouldn't be allowed to change who you actually are underneath it. Someone influential doesn't just watch how you handle falling apart. They watch how you handle standing up afterward, because that moment reveals whether the character built under pressure was real or just a temporary survival mechanism that dissolves the second the pressure lifts. You've already shown, in the small ways nobody was tracking closely, that success won't be the thing that finally corrupts what the fire couldn't. That's exactly the kind of evidence this invitation was waiting for. The final invitation isn't really an invitation at all. It's a recognition of something that already happened quietly, somewhere along the way, without any formal announcement. You stop waiting for permission to become who you were always meant to be. Somewhere in the middle of every storm, every betrayal, every season that should have convinced you to give up on yourself, you made a decision nobody witnessed and nobody applauded. You decided to keep becoming, regardless of whether anyone ever noticed, regardless of whether anyone ever extended a formal invitation into anything at all. That decision, made in private, sustained without an audience, is the actual source of everything that's happening now. The invitations weren't the beginning of your story. They were simply confirmation, arriving late, of a decision you'd already made long before anyone influential was paying attention. You didn't become chosen the moment someone noticed you. You were already choosing yourself every single day, long before that recognition ever arrived. So here's what all of these invitations add up to. Chosen one. You were never being watched because you were performing well. You were being watched because you kept choosing faith in moments where fear would have been so much easier, so much more understandable, so much more forgivable. Someone influential noticed, not your highlight reel, but your survival reel, and every invitation extended to you over these past several seasons has already been quietly accepted, whether you realize it or not, the moment you refuse to let any of it break you. Tell me in the comments which invitation felt the most like your own story, 1 through 14. And before you go, pay this message back the way it deserves. Like this video, subscribe, and carry this with you into whatever comes next.